All right, so today's tech topic is going to be about ESBs or enterprise service buses and specifically Node-RED in general. So I will begin to share my screen. Slideshow. Can everybody see this?
Yep.
Awesome. Okay, so today's tech topic is specifically on Node-RED. So just a quick agenda is we're going to go over what an ESB is and when to use it. ESB standing for Enterprise Service Bus. We're going to go over what Node-RED is. We're going to download and install it. We're going to go over use cases and demonstrations, which also leads into hacking it, which is something I had to do for the consulting project I'm on. The pitfalls and positives of using it, and then any questions and answers. But of course, feel free to ask questions and interject as you need. So first off, what is an ESB? So basically, we have this long description here, which I won't read fully out loud, but essentially it's a large distributed software that promotes connectivity, message protocols, high-level protocol communication between applications. So what does this mean in terms of software? It's about routing messages between services, monitoring messages, deployment control, and it does a lot more. It's a very large architectural structure. So when should we consider using an ESB? The first step for when opting to use an ESB architecture is to map its value to the requirements. So based on the source below, I gathered that these are the requirements that most people use when they want to decide to use an ESB. So when a system integration grows beyond 2 with additional integration requirements. So if you're integrating lots of software together, you should consider using an ESB because it will map those two and more rather seamlessly. So when you're using multiple protocols, such as FTP, HTTP, web service, JMS, this extends even further to WebSocket communication, all sorts of the TCP, UDP layer. And when there is a requirement for message routing based on message content and similar parameters. I also added a source link if you want to read more. That was actually a pretty good blog article on when to use it. Some examples of ESB services. There's open source and commercial. For open source, we have Apache Camel and Service Mix and Synapse. Apache Camel and Service Mix are some that I reviewed going over the contract. So I have a little bit of knowledge about Camel and Service Mix. They play specifically together. Service Mix is like Kubernetes is to Docker. It's a controller for the ESB service. So then we have OpenESB, Fuse ESB, which is designed by Red Hat, WSO2. There is a long list of those. Some examples that we may know for commercial, IBM Integration Bus, WebSphere, Microsoft Azure, they have a service bus as well, and so does Oracle with their Oracle Enterprise Service Bus. And again, that list was massive as well. So a lot of commercial products and open source products for ESB softwares and services. So why are we talking about Node-RED here? So in my contract at Ellucian, we were tasked with comparing, I believe it was 4 ESBs and 3 ESB-like software systems. Another person did WSO2. I began with Apache Camel and Service Mix, and then I moved over to Node-RED. Management they were unsure if an ESB was the right decision and needed proofs of concepts for all of these softwares, which also included an in-house proof of concept that they had designed several years ago. So I did a little bit of Camel and Service Mix before I transitioned over to Node-RED because I have a background in Node.js, so it was easier for me to give a POC on that. What is Node-RED? So Node-RED is a, quote, programming tool for wiring together hardware devices, APIs, and online services in new and interesting ways. Source, obviously, is their website. This essentially translates, it's a browser-based GUI that It uses SVGs and D3s to do drag and drop nodes from a palette into a flow diagram, which we will see in the demo. These nodes are customizable. You can either make your own node, you can make groups or clusters of nodes, or you can even publish your own node to the common repository that they host so that other people can use it as well. So there's multiple ways and places to run Node-RED. You can see more at their Get Starting page. We're going to use local installation and Docker, but they also have Raspberry Pi connected getting started guides, and they also have cloud-hosted guides as well. So we are going to demo installation with Docker, which is very easy. It's one command. I believe the next step, yeah, we're going to get right into it and do the demos. So if we just take this command right here, just for preemptive, you have to have Docker installed to run this command, which, I mean, that was pretty straightforward for Windows. So we'll paste that in, Docker run, oops. So we started the flows. Now we have a server running at the local address. Very easy. You don't have to do much anything else there. And if we go over and refresh this is Node-RED. So this is the palette manager over here. We have common, function, network, sequence, and parser and storage nodes. So all of these are nodes that you can just do whatever with. The injection node, they have these nice little tooltips on what they do. This is just a manual way of putting data into the pipeline. You have debug nodes, which will output to the debug console, which I will show you in just a moment. Catch statement status is linked in. I mostly worked with inject and debug off of this list. Then we get into more functional nodes, which literally starts off with function. This is a evaluated node. So this is where you can run your own JavaScript inside of the pipeline to do transformations. Then you also have switch nodes that route messages based on their property values or sequence position. Change nodes, which is essentially changing the properties. It's like an assignment when you're talking about code variables. You have, and there's a lot more, ranges, template functions, delay, trigger. You can execute, which is running the system command. And I didn't use this one, but report by exception. That's what that stands for. For these ones, I mostly paid attention to the HTTP in response and request, but you can also do WebSockets, TCP, UDP. And for these ones, they're essentially making an API endpoint. So you can create your own endpoints here and serve them in Node-RED specifically. Then we go into sequence, where you can just do some sorting, batch, join, split, basic operations against the message payload. You can parse file formats, CSV, JSON, XML, YAML, the common ones. And then storage. You can write in from a file, you can write out to a file, read in from a file, or you can even do a tail. So the next step is, what do we do to make a pipeline? How does this message flow through all of these? So I will actually show the demo of what I made here, where you can just take a JSON that you've already made instead of dragging and dropping, import it over here. And then you have nodes. So as of right now, this will not run because whenever you make a change, you have to hit this deploy button up here. So you hit it, successfully deployed. Now we can hit all of these API endpoints with Postman. So just a quick run over of what this is doing. This is doing a payload injection and testing an API endpoint over here. This is the HTTP in. Both of these are connected to, I believe it's a, that's a subflow. This is a collection of nodes inside of it, which I will show in just a moment. These are also API endpoints over here. Both of these are file uploads, which accept JSON. So the basic thing here is we started with a configuration. So in order for this flow up here to run, you need a configuration to test against. So we have this file right here. The method accepts posts, it accepts a file upload, you give it a URL, and then you give it a name, which is specified for the node. So if we open the debug tab over here in the upper right, we can see all nodes. And we'll go over into Postman, where I have a config route based setup. And I am just passing in some JSON with some different translations and transformations that we needed to do for this project. So if we run this, we get that back. So we have successfully uploaded the configuration. So if we go back over, we can look into the payload injection because that is doing what the API endpoints right here is doing. We can change the payload type, JSON, Boolean. So of course we're using JSON here, so that's what we will open up. And we're just passing first name, last name, social security, not a real one, date of birth, and GPA. Go back, we're done. So once we're done getting the payload injection ready, we have the configuration up. We're going to move further down the pipeline into these three subflows. So we can see what this is doing by editing the subflow template. So this is a config cache, excuse me. So what this is doing is this is the input from the pipeline flow, which we can I close this one out? No. Okay. So from here, this is that input. So that message payload is going into this input. It is going over to this function, which I can open up. And all it's doing is setting the global, which is preset. I did not define this. I'm setting the cache to the message payload, which is the properties that came into this subflow. From there, I'm reading the configuration file that we uploaded, and then we're going to go in here and apply the cache. So this is just a temporary switch where we get the global cache. We set the config to the payload, and then we set the payload to the temporary, and then return message, which is another predefined global. Message flows through the entire pipeline. And then after that, we just make sure it's in JSON. So we take the message config, we make sure it's in JSON, and we pass it out, which goes back into the flow and proceeds to the next one, which is rules mapping, gateway rules. These are semi-specific use cases of what we were doing. So we can go over into the rules mapping. What this does is this takes the message payload, goes through a transform, which I will open. It takes the message property, checks it if it has the key map, and if it does, run this JavaScript function. So what this is doing is this is just changing, if I remember correctly, it is just, so it's changing first name and last name. It's changing those properties in the config file to be something else, something that the configuration has specified. So if we go back and look, we'll see that we have the map, and that when we find first name like this, we're going to change it into first name underscore name as well, and the same for last name as well. So we apply that, and then this also applies to typecasting, which also applies in the configuration file. If you have a specific input number, it makes sure that it's the same type. Then we go back, and this one is, sorry, that's just a debug node. This will display on the side here as well. And then since we are working with an HTTP node, we need to give a response. The API knows what's happened. If we do the payload injection, this will not, it will give a small error just because for the sake of POC, I didn't want to duplicate the flows because these share the same. So we will deploy, and we will send a payload injection through. And from that initial object we saw, we go through, we see that the first name has been changed, the last name has been changed, and based on these gateway rules over here, which is essentially setting this gateway required true to false, is dependent on the GPA being greater than or less than 3. So if we see that the GPA is 2.9, the gateway course is required. This GPA is 3.9, so the gateway course is not required. And we can do the exact same thing through Postman via the testing, which sends the same thing through. So we send that, we get a response, and we get the same output, although this one does a join as well. So the whole purpose of this was to figure out how we can get all of this through with minimal code for the customer. So obviously we have some forms of code in here which are custom functions, but those are the only instances of code that was run on Node-RED. All the payload injection, the APIs, the responses, these are all built right in via the nodes on the side. So the next step was we needed to make sure that it handled multi-tenancy user logins. So instead of logging directly into the Docker container to get to the code, I went over and shut this one down. We should be able to refresh, and it should have nothing. Good. We go over here, and I'm sorry, that was the wrong one. Sure, the Docker container's down. Okay, yeah, we're okay. So I have Node-RED also installed here, so we'll npm start it. This one is just as easy, npm install Node-RED, and then it essentially runs itself. So same thing, it goes to the same port, so all we have to do is refresh, which it did automatically, and we have a login. This is because I have done some configurations in the code itself. So I believe this one is admin. And we have a different flow because this is what's been worked on. So another thing we can do is, this was when I was working on enabling and disabling flows based on user login. So we can see if we open this one up, we have this button down here, which disables or enables the node. So if we go, I believe that means disabled is on. Then we can log out. And then we have a second user, which I believe is just named user. Log in. We open this up as well. And since we do not have the read and write permissions, that disabled and enabled is no longer there because we don't want those users to enable and disable that node. We want the administration to control that. So that is something we were looking at. And we can see that over in the settings. Yes, the settings. So these are created in a hidden file on your desktop. It should be under users.node-red, and then you'll see the settings.js file where you create your users right here with the specific permissions. So admins have star permissions, they have everything. Users only have read permissions. So that was when we decided that we weren't going to go with Node-RED. We had discussions on it, so I didn't pursue that any further. So if we go back into, where's my PowerPoint? So that leads into the pitfalls and positives of where we ended up. So the main reason Node-RED was a contender was because of its GUI and the palette manager. It was very intuitive to use. The documentation was very good. It's very easy to install, run, and deploy to the cloud. Now, that was a big deal with management. They really loved the user interface for this because it was so easy to use. But we didn't choose it. We didn't choose Node-RED because it didn't meet the criteria for tenant-based pipelines. So what that means is specific customers have a specific tenant ID, and Node-RED doesn't have the capacity or architecture to support that. We asked the creators themselves. I believe one of the Ellucian team members posted on their discourse forum, and the creators told them that it doesn't support that. It's not recommended. Thank you, Razan. It just wasn't recommended as such. They didn't build it for that. That, and they were the only two contributors working at IBM working on that project. So there is risk associated with loss of community contribution there. And that was something that we discussed as well. So in the end, we went with the in-house solution because that's something that Ellucian can manage. And yeah, the tenant issue was also big as well, because that was a big blocker. They couldn't get around that. We couldn't get around that hacking. It would be too much work. We did a lot of pseudo story pointing to make sure that it really was the best decision. Should we build upon the in-house solution? Should we go with the Java solution? Or is it time spent better hacking this Node-RED? And it ended up looking like it was going to be more work than actually just creating it ourselves. So that is Node-RED. Any questions, comments, concerns? Do you want to see more demo of what it can do? Please let me know.
Thanks, Jordan.
Yeah, all right. Silence means no. Thank you for attending. I really appreciate this opportunity to show this off. This was pretty fun software to use. So if it meets your criteria, I highly recommend it.